today we are going to quickly talk about a little bit about the EDI and the EDI fund background, and then we will talk about the 2020 funds available and what the different buckets are. And I will start us off, and then I'll hand it over to Michael. So next slide, Michael. We have about $5.8 million available from the Equitable Development Initiative Fund this year, as you guys have seen it in the RFP process. And I just want to give you a little bit of a quick warning that my daughter might just like come in here any moment. I'm hearing so just please excuse me if I get interrupted. But yeah, again, the Equitable Development Initiative is about 4 years old right now, and we will go through what is available. And I like this slide around, like, a lot of times we get to this work from the perspective of how do we manage risk, but EDI is flipping that conversation and kind of having a conversation and partnership with the communities most impacted on what are we doing to try to make sure that we're mitigating displacement and increasing access to opportunity. Next, Michael. So I will start with the EDI origin story of the shoulders that we are standing in, the folks who are part of and really playing a huge role in starting the Equitable Development Initiative and advocating for it. Like I said, it's about 4 years old, but the advocacy started over 5 years ago. And South Communities Organizing for Racial and Regional Equity, a coalition of, at the time, about 20 community organizations working on a vision for community-controlled and inspired development, mostly in Rainier Valley, came together with the vision to really integrate racial equity in the comprehensive plan. And their focus was in, like I said, Rainier Valley mostly. They had some Chinatown ID representatives that were part of the community organizations that was part of the coalition. And then the other group that I want to lift up is RESET, the Race and Social Equity Task Force. And this is a task force that was formed to create, inform, and implement the Equitable Development Implementation Plan. And then Office of Planning and Community Development, or Office of Civil Rights, resourced the Race and Social Equity Task Force, not only to come up and come up with the EDIP, the Equitable Development Implementation Plan, but to also do the equity analysis to inform this work and then advocate for it. And then and at the time, the person that was working for Office of Planning and Community Development and continued, left the job and went to the CSI, Center for Social Inclusion, but continued to really consult and build capacity with the Race and Social Equity Task Force. Next. So EDI, like I said, is more of a values-based program. And our first value is around what are we doing to center communities most impacted by displacement. They're the ones who are always close to the solutions and have the solutions. So how do we, as a program, support them with investments and capacity building to co-create those solutions? EDI has a community-driven strategies value, again, in how are we making sure that this work that these communities are advancing comes from these communities, and folks are not just parachuting and saying that, this is the work or project that this community needs. We lean into acknowledging historic injustices. I'll show you a map of a 1930 redlining map and how that is really right now kind of similar to what the impact that we're seeing on the ground. We have values around accountability, again, both internal city accountability, working with different departments, to external accountability, making sure that we are accountable to these communities that are most impacted. And then leverage, how is the communities most impacted by displacement that are advancing these community-driven strategies, leveraging the projects, the work at both the neighborhood level and city level that they're doing. How are they coming up with different strategies, policies, investments to advance their project is another value that we lean in towards. And then really understanding flexibility and interdependence is a key. You know, we have these maps that we normally rely on which geographies to focus on. But again, you know, we see communities like, you know, the Native Americans who are displaced from all over the city, right? So they don't have one neighborhood. So how are we flexible with the program and recognizing that we are all of these different neighborhoods and these projects are interdependent, and even really recognizing, you know, as displacement has occurred, and how are we making sure that the folks who work here, you know, and play here, eat here, also really have a space to convene and to really advance the work that we're doing. And last but not least, it's around system change. We cannot get into those racial equity outcomes that we want to see in our theory of change unless internally we are also doing systems change, both at the individual level and the structural level. Next. So again, the Equitable Development Initiative has 3 parts. I add another part to it. It started with equity analysis that was done 5 years ago when the city of Seattle was going, especially the Department of Planning, embarking on the journey of the 2035 comprehensive plan, right? That was like 20 years from like 5 years ago. And it was the first time that any city did an equity analysis. And then that was followed by working with the Policy Link, a think tank, a national think tank, to do a race and social equity goals and policies in every element of the comprehensive plan. And like I said earlier, and based on the equity analysis and where the needs were, and Race and Social Equity Task Force came up with an equitable development implementation plan in partnership with the city. And the 4th thing that's missing from here is the Equitable Development Fund that followed all this work. Next. So kind of we had a value around acknowledging past injustices. This is the map from 1930, the Redlining Map, that tells the story of where investment decisions were made and how those decisions by previous generations contribute to the inequities that our communities are experiencing today. As you can see, it was color-coded based on, you know, where and the green and blue, which is best and still desirable, a lot of the investments happen, and was known to the number of, you know, and percentage of like white people that ended up living in those areas, right? And then the areas that were designated as definitely declining or hazardous are the same neighborhoods nowadays that, you know, have either a high number of people of color and are experiencing inequities like displacement and inequities like low access to opportunity. And even right now as we speak, you know, and, you know, the triple impacts of COVID: community economic development, displacement, and health impacts. Next. So these are the maps that came from the equity analysis that we did: the risk of displacement and access to opportunity. If you actually overlay the previous map to this map, those areas that were coded as definitely declining or hazardous are the same neighborhoods of today that no matter which growth strategy the city was going to go with, that were going to be impacted by displacement or had low access to opportunity, with the exception of neighborhoods like Chinatown ID and Central area, which a lot of gentrification and displacement has already happened. And because of their proximity to downtown and job center, they have high access to opportunity, but still the communities that are supposed to be benefiting from those high access jobs are not benefiting from it. Next. So a lot of times we are asked about what the layers were that were used to produce this equity analysis index. And these are 2, like I talked about, downtown and CID and central areas proximity to regional jobs. This is the travel time to designated King County urban centers and manufacturing and industrial centers. And as you can see, this is an example of how the access to opportunity map was produced. Or the second one on my right, It might be on your left, the household income. Again, percentages of population with income below 200% of the federal poverty level. You see the greens, the light greens, the dark greens, and the blues. You know, again, over and 40% of people who have an income of less than 200% of the federal poverty level in those areas in Othello and Rainier Beach. And if you have any questions around the equity analysis, we can get you to the person who did it. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert on that. Try my best to explain it, but like if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask us. We'll get you the response that you need. Next, Michael. So again, in another way to say this, I'm not a planner, so I appreciate that I work with a bunch of super smart planners who put those maps together. For me, though, using words, these neighborhoods that we focus on, these priority neighborhoods, place-based neighborhoods, one, have high level of chronic and recent displacement risk. They have seen historically historic disinvestment, like I said earlier. Again, they have a huge number of marginalized communities. And then also what we saw, especially around when the Race and Social Equity Task Force was coming together to advocate across neighborhood, they were all already working on community-driven strategies that were created through inclusive community engagement, right? So they even called out some of those projects in the implementation plan, the Equitable Development Implementation Plan, and the financial strategy that followed it. And then obviously, as we know, a lot of these neighborhoods are in this kind of new major transportation investments, the light rail that came in 2009. For example, the South Communities Organizing for Racial and Regional Equity, that one group that I talked about earlier that played a huge role in advocating for the equitable development, they came together when they recognized the kind of displacement that this major transportation investment brought to their communities. Next. So this is the equitable development framework. It has the dual purpose of mitigating displacement and increasing access to opportunity while building on the local cultural assets of those communities, and the goal of creating strong people and strong communities to achieve community stability and resilience in the face of this displacement. And then these 6 equity drivers are designed to be deployed together in order for them to have transformational outcome. We as a department and working with the interim advisory board recognize that not one department or not even one community or one neighborhood can do one of these things and create transformational change, right? You can really be focusing on economic mobility and just creating just one change in this, neighborhood level or project level. But if we deploy all these projects, all these equity drivers together, we believe that that's how we can get to these racial equity outcomes that, again, we want to get to in our theory of change. Next, Michael. So I am gonna actually hand it over to Michael to start talking about the criteria for the RFP and the next and slides. Michael, you're it.
Okay, and can everybody see the whole slides, all the columns of the slides? Okay, I have a bunch of screens up, so I can't tell what you guys are saying. So as Uba talked about, there's sort of the core functions of EDI, and so we kind of consider those the core, or the backbone of the program that are not going to change no matter what the specific program or activity we're doing. And so on the left hand side, you can see prioritizing investments into high risk of displacement areas, aligning with the history of redlining and displacement. The equity drivers that she talked about in the previous slide, and what the integration of investments that serve the whole community and aren't driven by the functional area of whatever the program is doing, without thinking about how those impacts may affect other parts of the community. And then really importantly is the depth of relationship for the people who are doing the work and the people who are the supposed intended beneficiaries. And Uba mentioned this in talking about, not wanting to provide funding to programs that are parachuting in when there are community organizations that are doing the work already and have spent time on the ground building relationships and come from the communities that are impacted. And so those are the folks that we want to prioritize resourcing. The other things that tend to be additive in depending on sort of the specific priorities of the funding in any given RFP are, geographic distribution. So, making sure that we're not only funding one area of the city when there's clearly displacement impacts happening in other areas. And so trying to, not give parity per se, and spread it around, but to understand that different communities are in fact dealing with different challenges. And so trying to be mindful of that. The unmet needs part is around, where is since the EDI fund is relatively small, especially for a program that's trying to do capital and projects and real estate, where can we put our resources that are the most beneficial to our partners, and where are we looking in the system to see what are folks most struggling to get funded for, and how do we tailor the program to meet those needs and not just be another program that's doing something that other people are already doing. And then attached to that is sort of how are we thinking about being in partnership for the long term with projects. And so we know that we're going to get into relationship with the project sponsors and that organization, and that we're going to be working with them for a long time. And so, when thinking about, okay, the review committee says, yeah, this is a project that we want you to be working with, what is the future of that relationship, and how are we going to be building an additive as we move through? And that, creates a lot of complexity because once we accept partners in, generally speaking, with the real estate projects, we have a deep commitment to trying to see that project be successful in the back end. And that can take multiple iterations of investment and many years to complete. All right. And so in the RFP guidelines, we have a sort of give this as guidance to the reviewers and also to applicants to say, okay, what exactly do we mean by these values? And so here, we're highlighting the depth of relationship is sort of our way of teasing out, is a project being authentic to what they're saying, and are the people doing the application, are they authentic to the work that's trying to be done? And so, is this white-led organization with only people of color on the frontline staff who are saying that they're providing a strategy for a majority people of color community? That may be a problem. If there's no actual interest in anti-displacement or community development, and it's sort of like, well, we happen to be doing work in a high-risk displacement area, so we think this makes sense, then maybe that's not a strong enough a fit, because how is this project being an investment that will prevent people from having to leave and not actually an investment that may have a gentrifying or displacing effect on people? So another example is, Uba mentioned the equity drivers. And so again, this is sort of asking, does it meet 3 equity drivers? Is it at a scale perhaps where the project would have an effect on the equity drivers or have some sort of real tangible benefit for the people who are sort of the target for the programming or the services that are provided? And some of this stuff is a little ambiguous, because we all understand that one single housing project, for example, is not going to cure the the affordability crisis in the city, and one economic development project isn't going to eliminate the disparity in income and living wages between people of color and and white communities. And so we understand that, you know, we're not asking for people to be like, yep, we're going to do this project and then everything is going to be great. But we do want people thinking about, you know, how are there going to be tangible benefits to the community. So those are two of the examples, and in the RFP, you can see sort of guidance for all of the different core and supplementary criteria that we're going to be using this year. So folks tend to ask us kind of what projects that have been in the pipeline in the past and were accepted, you know, like what are the kind of things that they're doing that highlighted themselves to the review committee. So here's sort of some examples. You know, the United Indians of all tribes and their sort of foundational work within the indigenous community, the Friends of Little Saigon and their role in both community and neighborhood planning, and also in being a nexus and support for a lot of the small businesses in Little Saigon. Africa Town with their focus on building community wealth and creating ownership for the African American community in the central area, and Chief Seattle Club with their, you know, restorative justice and their program that really is designed around sort of not just providing services but doing community healing. And so those are kind of the things that, you know, when folks are looking at who is this organization and what are they trying to accomplish, that these are things that sort of help folks rise up and become really clear that these are organizations that are working to fulfill the EDI values. Some other examples, and again, historically, we've been primarily focused on the ownership of land as one of the core community wealth and anti-displacement strategies. And so, you know, here's 6 examples of projects that are working on that, and some, like the ones on top, came with very specific real estate needs, whereas the 3 projects on the bottom came in and said, you know, we need capacity building because we need to scope out projects and we need to have a process that's accountable to our community and how we envision that before we run off and say this is what the project's going to be. You know, we really want to be thoughtful and take time to do that. And so those projects entered into partnership with us from the capacity building perspective and then are moving forward. And so a background about the funding. So, you know, EDI started with an initial 16 million from the sale of the Civic Square block, which is the on 3rd and James, the big hole in the ground that the city sold off. And so some of that money was sort of the seed funding for EDI, and that supported 5 initial projects that were designated by council and are specified in the implementation plan, as well as the first funding round we did. We also get $5 million from the short-term rental tax. This year, we're sort of getting backfilled from general fund because there is no money coming in from the short-term rental tax, but it's intended to be a permanent funding source. And so the money from the RFP this year is coming from that. The CDBG is a federal program that is very complicated to use, and it comes with a lot of rules. So historically, we've tried to find projects and partners that are a good fit, because often CDBG costs more to use than it does to actually receive the grants. So in this year, we're putting out a little bit of money from 2019 and 2020, but it's again going to very specific uses for projects that we already know it won't be damaging for. And the last bit of funding is when the Mercer, another piece of surplus property was the Mercer Mega Block, and 15 million of that, the sale proceeds, were directed to us to create an acquisition fund, because in the previous funding rounds, we were making awards for projects that were capped at $1 million, but that isn't actually enough to secure site control in almost any project that the city is, or any neighborhood in the city for any reasonably sized project. And so that funding is specifically for adding to projects that have identified a site that they need to acquire, and then helping backfill whatever the gap is between the award and the purchase price. And so about 5.2 of that is supposed to go out this year, and hopefully the remaining 9.8 will go out next year. This year's RFP is going to be a little different in where since February, where we've been trying to respond to the fact that our world is very different, right, with COVID, and now the downturn that immediately followed that, with the economy, and then also with all of the Black Lives Matter movement that's going on. So the world has changed, and we are trying to uh, adapt the program to better serve community and think about what the immediate needs are. And so what we heard over and over again was, you know, nonprofits everywhere and project and partners who are doing the work in community really need some simple support and some stability. And while there are some really exciting capital projects going on, this year the focus needs to be on just helping folks either meet payroll or doing the things that they know they need to do in community to take care of each other, and having simple resources to do that. And so we've really pivoted to doing much smaller grants. So, we'll do a lot more grants, but they'll be $50,000, and they'll be very flexible in terms of what people can use that for. And so the idea is, you all as applicants know what's going on in your communities, and you know what the priority needs to be. And so that could be providing direct community support and saying, there are all of these other programs that are providing resources, but there's a gap in our community that's really specific, and we just need to put out dollars to people. And that's okay. It could be, this is a moment in time where leadership is really important, and how do we support those leaders as they're coming and doing the advocacy to change the world to a better place. And so what does it look like to have some funding to support that leadership, either organizationally or individually? And also still, what is, we know that there's a lot of things coming down in the pipe, and that could be stimulus money or disaster gentrification, in which speculative investors may try to take advantage of the economic downturn to take land away from communities of color, and then proceed on a path where it's much harder later to stop displacement. And so if folks are doing planning or strategies around how to prevent some of that, that's also, a core use of the funding. And this year's 5 million is getting spread pretty thin. And so, existing organizations are primarily getting resource just to stay in place. We've pulled out a little bit of money, including the CDBG dollars, for a few capital projects that may have an imminent funding need to maintain their timeline. So, these projects sort of get their schedule and they're moving forward, and some of them are probably going to be breaking ground at the end of the year, and they may have a small funding gap. And so we've tried to set up some money to not have major setbacks with the partners, but that's primarily why the existing organizations have that amount in there. Is we've got 25 project partners already that are getting renewed support, so that they don't have a funding gap organizationally, and then setting aside a little bit to help with sort of emergency capital needs. Some of you are representing or interested in folks who have our existing EDI partners. This RFP is not for those folks. We'll have a separate process for existing partners to access these resources that we'll be rolling out in the next week or so. So this RFP is really about this next bucket here, which is the new partnerships, and it is only available to programs or projects who are not existing partners. And so we understand that there's a lot of resources going to existing projects to keep them moving forward, but we wanted to make sure that we also had a real opportunity for new folks to engage with us. And so this 1.75 million is what this RFP is primarily about, and we'll talk a little bit about it more. There are two other things that we pulled a little bit of money off. There's currently an open funding round through the Office of Sustainability and the Environment and their environmental justice program. Their program is about 250,000 a year, and we added some funding to their program. So now they're going to be able to do 500,000 in this funding round. And that is because we had some real interest in some environmental justice and some health equity work. But they're a better vehicle since they're already set up to do that and be more specific about it. And so rather than create a duplicative process that people had to apply to twice, if that was really what met their needs, we just added funding to that program. There's nothing that says people can't apply to us and the OSE program. So feel free to do that if you think that they're good fits. And then the Seattle Together partnership is a city interdepartmental team that is working on sort of civic togetherness as it relates to, it started with the COVID-19 response and just sort of, especially with all the isolation that's going on, helping folks be together and sort of engage with each other. And if folks have questions about that later, Uba can talk a little bit more about that if needed. But for the RFP, there are sort of the funding is going to get split into in three pathways. Folks can apply to all three if they think that that funding, if their project meets all of those, and you would do a 2-page narrative for each one that you thought applied. The idea being that we're trying to limit the amount of writing that everybody would have to do, but that gives you a chance to sort of be specific about why you think the project meets whatever criteria for each 3 buckets. So the first one is the BIPOC social infrastructure. And that is, again, sort of a response to the Black Lives Matter work and also just the disparate harms that have come from COVID and all of the extra work that's needed to do to keep the social infrastructure in communities of color stable and strong. And so that's the overview of what that funding is supposed to be doing. The economic and recovery and disaster gentrification focus is sort of more the forward-looking part of the project, or projects that are sort of saying, okay, how can we be ready to address the challenges that we know will inevitably come in sort of the cycles that we're in. And some of this is born from looking at how stimulus dollars came through the city and the state and the county last time there was a downturn, and that there was such a preoccupation on shovel readiness with those dollars. And that ended up meaning that resources went to already wealthier communities because they were able to keep their projects alive and moving forward. And so then they were the ones that appeared most shovel ready. And so we're trying to establish some resources so that communities who are working on projects or have really good ideas that would be good fits for reinvestment or stimulus can do the work to meet those shovel readiness thresholds if and when they come down the pipe. And then the last bucket is really about just immediate COVID community response, and that can be very broad. The priority is really looking at where are there gaps in the system that folks need support on that other funders aren't doing. We're not trying to be duplicative of other work that's happening if we can avoid it, but we also want to be really flexible with partners around, we're in a global pandemic, and so being creative about how to take care of each other is going to be a priority of this. So the timeline, again, the RFP is released. We're on the first webinar. Thank you for being our guinea pigs as we test out all of the mechanics. But there will be 2 more next week, and then we'll have one on the 17th. That's really that last one will hopefully be, you know, folks have had a chance to sit with the RFP and the application, and if there are sort of follow-up questions that people have to put the polish on, that's a great opportunity to sign in and ask those. But of course, people are feel free to contact us if you have questions in the meantime. The applications are due on the 23rd, and then once the applications are in, we will constitute the review committee. The review committee is always drawn by community members who have lived experience with the work that's trying to be done. And so we'll be trying to get content experts in each 3 bucket to provide some guidance to us on the proposals that make the most sense. The other thing that's going to happen is because folks can apply for multiple buckets or multiple priorities, after the initial review is complete for each of those priority areas, all of the reviewers will then meet as a full group to be able to evaluate whether, you know, certain folks came in and they, you know, they had a really good story and they were getting funded by everybody, and maybe that's okay, and maybe we want to take a look and say, you know, this is a little too concentrated, and actually, if folks are getting funded, you know, there are other people who are getting left out who are doing work, and there's real equity gaps in when we look at that initial pass. And so we want to take a more holistic look. And so that's kind of what that longer time frame is sort of 2 sets of review to make sure that we're really holding true to our values in the decisions. And then once the review committee makes their recommendations, there's some amount of time of city process to get the final sign off to release. And so, you know, we try to move that as quickly as we can, but typically it's taken about a month. So likely we're looking at, you know, mid to late November. We're going to really try to not have it stretch into Thanksgiving so that people at least can have notification, but you'll have to bear with us on that depending on what happens. And then the goal, again, since these are small grants, is to have a pretty quick contracting process and to get the money out the door. And these are one-time grants. You know, this is different from, you know, the projects that we've normally done where if you're accepted into the EDI fund, you know, you're sort of a partner with us for a long period of time. This is really about spreading resource around a lot farther and just queuing up folks to be able to, you know, make it through 2021 and get out the other side. And then the next RFP, we'll be reevaluating whether we return to the sort of more the old practice or whether we need to continue to have new changes to reflect the realities on the ground. But our hope would be that everybody is pretty much wrapped up by the end of next year. So that is the presentation, and I will go on mute for a while. And if folks want to put questions in the chat box, that would be great. Or if folks want to raise their hands, I will do my best to make sure that I'm scrolling correctly to catch everybody. But feel free to, the rest of this time is question and answer for all of you. So Jane had a question in the chat. I don't know who all can see it, but just I'll read it off. So the question was, does that mean you will not be funding capital projects this time around? And can we say more about BIPOC? So I'll answer the second one first. So BIPOC is an acronym, stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So that is, you know, us acknowledging that the folks who are most impacted by historical harms like redlining or the indigenous genocide or other sort of explicit racist policies of the city, state, and federal government are generally borne by people of color, and particularly disparities are seen around Black and Indigenous folks. And so, you know, that is going to be the predominant focus of our funding program. And you know, our assumption, again, going back to our values, is that the folks who are impacted by those harms should be the folks who are leading the healing and the repair of those solutions. And so that's kind of what we mean when we talk about that. In terms of capital funding, yeah, there is no, the grants are $50,000. So there's not, our assumption is that that's not going to be very meaningful for most capital projects, but it can fund planning work or feasibility work to queue up projects if that's what folks want to do. If 50,000, if a grant for $50,000 would make a significant difference to a capital project, we could have that conversation about, how to do that. But our assumption here is that that's not what these contracts will be, and they'll be much simpler and faster and easier for folks to use. But we can certainly brainstorm with folks about specific projects if there's something specific going on where perhaps that might make sense. But that, again, that's not the intention of this funding round. Next question. Can you talk about how the applying organization has to be structured, and what if it's an organic community organization working on Seattle Parks land? So historically, and again, I'll answer the second one first just because I hate doing things in correct order. The parks land is a little interesting because historically the review committees have not wanted to fund city facilities or city investments. And that sort of gets to, is the project building wealth for community? And if one city program is funding what is really the responsibility of another city program to do, and that doesn't transfer into ownership, that can be pretty problematic. So for things like programming, that might be a little bit of a different conversation. So we as staff are not the decision makers in the review process, so I can't speak to what might happen, but I think that I could see there being more flexibility around something because we're not expecting to do real significant investments that are designed to create wealth, or build tangible assets, that perhaps there could be something else. In terms of the applying organizations generally, we have an expectation that folks have some ability to manage funding. We used to, when we first did the funding, require 501c3 status or fiscal sponsorship. That ended up being really complicated for everybody and ended up costing a lot of money in circumstances where it didn't always make sense. So we waived that rule. The other reason we no longer require nonprofits is because, if we're serious about building wealth for people, then requiring people to never make any wealth is sort of a problematic approach. And so we don't want to immediately layer on so many restrictions that, we're not actually addressing racialized wealth gaps. And so we've been flexible about that. There needs to be something that we can obviously sign a contract with. So there has to be an organization of some kind that can receive a check and can track it and can be accountable to the deliverables of the contract. But I think there is flexibility in that, in the way that there would be flexibility in how we enter in consulting contracts for services for other things. So if it's a really specific question there beyond what I've answered, that might be something that we want to talk about offline and get into the more specifics of what that circumstance is. But let me know if that answered the question. Skipped from Leah about the 5.2 million for land acquisition. So again, that is that's going to be through a totally different process than this RFP. We're working out the final specifics of that, and that will get released separately. Again, that funding is for the existing projects to cover the gaps between what their award of the $1 million capital cap that we had on the previous RFPs and whatever the final purchase price. So that's again a pretty specific funding source that was created to solve a very specific problem, and so information about how to access that will hopefully be out pretty soon, but that'll go to the existing project partners. So we'll probably, let in CAYA's case, we'll probably let Chetty and Joe know, here's what that looks like, and then they can consult with you all about the strategy for something like that.
And can I add something to that, Michael?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so out of that $5.2 million, we just have $2 million left. The other $3.2 million has already been allocated to organizations like ABAC that's about to close on their property, and other organizations that we can't talk about right now because they're in negotiations. So we have $2 million left that we're going to have a process for, not $5.2 million.
Yeah, and then hopefully our process will be the field test, so that when the 9.2 or the 9.8 million in 2021 comes available, we sort of have a knowledge of how to go about doing that that's a little more efficient, so that we're not waiting another year to get that money out. Any other questions? We can give folks a few more minutes to ponder, but don't feel obligated to sit around, because I'll just start talking about random things. And again, Uba and I are available to be reached out to directly. I believe our email addresses, which is the best way given that we're all working remotely, to make contact if you can. But if there's questions that come up in the meantime, or again, if there's something really specific that you're thinking about that we need to get in the weeds on, we'd love to dive into that with you and help you get those answers sooner rather than later, so you can make the best application you can. If you have any other questions again, or if you have any feedback on the mechanics of this, or things that we should cover that we can do better for the next ones, please also shoot us that information and let us know. So, we have 3 more of these to do, and we're ideally going to get better every time we do them. So, but thanks everybody for tuning in.